Okay, so as we have been doing, we'll start here. For those of you that read ahead or are familiar with this parable, and just your initial thoughts. We'll come back to this maybe at the end, but just your initial thoughts. The laborers in the vineyard, where would you tend to categorize this parable? The surprise of God's kingdom, God's upside-down nature of the kingdom, or God's kingdom when faced with crisis, that it requires a decision that needs to be made? Dan? Requires a decision? Okay. What does the other part of you want to say? I'm just, yeah. So you're not 100% in. Gotcha. Okay. And by the way, like I said, in no way are any of these am I like, nope, that's the wrong answer. Like, we've talked about some that seems like there could be several of them. So what'd you say? What'd you say? Upside down? Okay. Got some votes for upside down. Anybody else? Mike. See, I've guilted Mike into making comments. He doesn't comment when I teach, so now he's first on the scene. Thank you, Mike. Okay. Okay. No. Spiritual battle. Yeah. I like it. Okay. Anybody else? Any other comments? And again, we'll probably, if we have time, we'll come back to this at the end after we've read through it, gone through it, and see if your thoughts change, if you have some more thoughts. Okay, so getting into this a little bit. You're in Matthew chapter 20. One of the things I'll first point out as we kind of talk about what's going on at this time during this parable when Jesus is giving this parable, if you just started reading chapter 20, I would tell you that despite there being a chapter division there, there's actually no break in the narrative between this section and the previous section. So let's take a look back. What's happening in chapter 19? Either just high-level discussions, people Jesus is talking to. What's happening in chapter 19? I mean, there's a lot, so you can't, it's hard to go wrong there. You're like, I thought we were only studying Matthew 20. I know, I threw you there. Say that again. Teachings on divorce. And the rich young man, the rich young ruler. Right, that story I think we're all familiar with. Children, yes. Yep. Anything else? Who's asking? Yeah. Peter, yeah. His disciples are asking. Yeah. That absolutely, and that's exactly what's happening here. So, starting in verse 16 of chapter 19, we read about the story of the rich young ruler. Jesus actually interacting with this man, and that leads the disciples who are with him to hear this. And then verse 23 and 24, Jesus tells his disciples it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than the rich to enter heaven. And then 25 and 26. We see the disciples are really kind of chewing on this. This is hard. Some of this is hard for them to understand. And then Peter asks, just as Annette pointed out, basically asks, what about us? What about us? Those of us that have been with you the whole time, we've done everything that you told the rich man to do. We've checked all those boxes. What do we get? And Jesus begins to teach. And then how does chapter 19 end? Very last, I know I hate when I point to a very specific thing and ask you to read it, but how does chapter 19 end in verse 30? Yes. So that's a thought that continues into chapter 20. Last will be first, the first will be last. This thought continues right in. So as we get into chapter 20 and we get into this parable of the labor in the vineyard, who is Jesus talking to? Yeah, I think you're right, Perry. I think Perry said it looks like he's still talking to his disciples that were with him there. And I think that's right. I think he continues this thought from 19 where Peter asks this question. And Jesus continues this concept, last shall be first, the first shall be last, and he goes right into this parable in chapter 20. And then, one other thing I'd add, so kind of location, we've been trying to, it's hard when you talk about location. We know a lot of Jesus' ministry was done around Galilee, that area, but we also know that he started to, at some point, travel to Jerusalem. And I think that is what we're starting to see here as the location for him delivering this parable, is he is on the way to Jerusalem. And we'll point that out here in just a minute as to why I think that. But so he's on the move. He's talking to the disciples, I think, at this point. And it's a carryover conversation and a lesson from Matthew 19. Any comments, any questions? This is going to be kind of hard to see. So what we have at the top here is the Galilean area where his ministry, a lot of his ministry would have been done. And then the circle at the bottom is Jerusalem. So that's kind of showing you geographically the travel that would have been made. And then what we see, a couple different things. So we read in Matthew 19, verse 1, now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And we also read later in chapter 20, as they went out of Jericho, a great man followed him. So traditionally, there would have been, at least from what I've read, 3 different traditional routes that people making a pilgrimage from Galilee down to Jerusalem that they would have taken. And based on some of the scripture here, what I'm thinking is it would have been, if you see this red dot that follows out to it goes east of the Jordan, it kind of goes around it here, and then it circles back and comes into Jericho and then into Jerusalem. Again, just my speculation, but it gives you some idea. What some of the things that we're reading that I've read about this kind of traditional route, this red line, I'll call it. It passes through this region that's called Perea, and then it crosses back over the Jordan River near Jericho. It would have taken somebody traveling this about 5 to 7 days to make this trip. Because of the Jewish communities in this area of Perea, this region was a little bit more safe, a little bit more hospitable than if they had gone through Samaria for anybody that was making this pilgrimage from Galilee down to Jerusalem. So again, just speculation here based on some of the information we have. I think Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, quite possibly on this red line, on this path, on his way down. Can't tell you exactly where in that stretch, but kind of on his way. So, all right, let's get into the text a little bit. So I'm going to break this out a little bit. Matthew 20, we're going to read verses 1 through 7. Matthew 20, 1 through 7, and we'll pull out some thoughts here. So Matthew 20, 1 through 7. For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And going out about the 3rd hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, you go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you. So they went. Going out again, about the 6th hour and the 9th hour, he did the same. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing, and he said to them, why do you stand here idle all day? And they said to him, because no one has hired us. And he said to them, you go into the vineyard too. Anything jump out at you? Anything noteworthy from this section? He was giving other people opportunity to do the work. Yeah. Yep. They'd gone, let's just assume they were where they needed to be to get hired, and no one was hiring them. Let me back up. The master here was constantly looking for those to come work for him in his vineyard throughout the whole day. Yeah, that's a good point, Valerie. Yep. Yep, I've read that. I've read that as well. Yeah. Yeah. So the wage that they agreed upon was fair wage, right, for one day's work. Okay? Anything else? Some of them got there at lunchtime. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean it's kind of when you think about this, they were getting hired, as Valerie said, like throughout the day, all different periods of the day, well into the evening as well. The only thing I'll note too that I never picked up on before. By the way, like I love that we're doing this series on the parables because I know the stories, the big picture stories, but this is forcing me to get into them a lot more and actually pay more attention to the details. And when I do that, I'm able to pull out a little bit more. At least I think I am. And one of the things I noticed that I didn't realize before is that two kinds of workers were hired this day. Anybody seeing what I'm seeing? That's a good point too. No, I was thinking, so the first ones, it says, let me stop trying to stare up there and actually look at my notes here. Verse 2, after agreeing with the laborer for a denarius a day. It sounds like there was a contract that was formed there that was negotiated right away. They agreed upon, how much are you going to pay me? I'm going to pay you this. Okay, go do it. I'm going to do it for one denarius. What does he say to the others? Go do it and I'll pay you what's fair. Right? And I think that's important. There's a difference in how they approach this work. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Anything else in these first 7 verses? Maybe there might be, and motivation is a huge part. The reason why we do things is a huge part of, I think, a lot of these parables. I think all the parables, quite honestly, and how that correlates to those that enter the kingdom of heaven. Okay. Someone was looking to bring people in. They didn't come find him. Again, the master in this case was out looking for those to bring in. Yeah. Bill? Yeah. It does use the word idle. They're just kind of hanging out, kind of loitering. Like, sometimes we really want to get something, and sometimes we just kind of want to act like we do, right? I don't really want to work today, but I'll kind of hang out in this area. I like that. So when you said that so David brought up the point about no one had hired them. That made me think about, Jesus has already talked about in his parables those that appear less desirable. When he's talking to the Pharisees and kind of their elevated mindset versus those that, we just talked about the tax collector, right? These kind of less desirable people that may not have been first choice to be hired based on appearance, based on social status. What, Mike? Got passed over, perhaps? Yeah? Sure. Go ahead, Valerie. Nope, you're fine. Mhm. Are you going to pick me? Pick me? Yeah, yeah. Harry? You needed more? Yeah. Harvest is plenty, but the laborers are few. Absolutely. All right. Anything else before we move on to the next section? Okay. Let's continue. We're going to read. Oh, sorry, Kevin, go ahead. Yeah. Fair point. Yeah, there's some level of kind of discriminating based on, like you said, possibly whether it's they were the qualified, they were there and ready at the first time, whatever it might be. The fact that you're continuing to bring people in, and there were some people at the very end of the day that hadn't been picked for whatever reason. Yeah, there is something to that. You have something? You get picked up. Yeah. Yeah. You're right, and there can be the possibility of kind of allegorizing every little detail, but it's yeah, I agree. Yeah, right, right, yeah. Just like the so Bill, he was if you couldn't hear. Yeah, so that's exactly right. And just like we looked at the Pharisee and the tax collector, that didn't actually happen. That was a parable that Jesus told as an example. Those point to, just like this one, those that obey the gospel, whether it's early in life or late in life, still get the same reward, right? Um, we're on that. Now you're reaching it, Dan. Yeah, I think it's a good point too. And as we go through these parables, there are common threads, I think, common elements, I should say, that Jesus is constantly driving home. I want to talk about that later here too, but there are a lot of similarities through some of the messaging. Because, again, remember, the parables were meant to, in one of the purposes was to proclaim the kingdom, the coming of the kingdom. And in doing so, we're talking about who's going to be in that kingdom, right? And so some of those commonalities are going to keep coming up in the parables. Okay, last one, and we got to move on. Here. See, this is the problem when I let you all make too many comments, is then you just like steal all my notes for the end of class. So I need to just shut it down after. No, I appreciate it. You're right, and I agree with you, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Okay, let's start in verse 8. And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first." And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. And when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. And on receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." All right, we'll pause here for a minute. Anybody read this, and some of you can kind of empathize with the first group? It's like, that's not fair, right? We've been here all day. These guys just showed up. Can you draw on like comparisons in your life where that's happened? You know, how do we feel when we've done everything right? We've put in the work. You know, and then someone just kind of steps right in and is kind of given equal status with you, or given equal credit. How do you feel about that? Are you happy for them? You turn around and go like, "Hey, I'm glad you can be a part of this with me," right? I worked all day, but and you didn't. But I mean, I'm glad you're here with me, and I'm glad you're getting paid too. And that's, or do we get? Or that's not how it goes, right? We usually kind of get angry, we get resentful, we get frustrated. Mike, okay. Whispering in one person's ear, and they're whispering in another, and I like it. Mary, didn't have a union. No, they did not. Okay, right. They knew up front they were getting. It's exactly what I thought. Yeah, when we were studying that last week. Yeah, that's exactly what I thought. So Scott brought up the example last week of the prodigal son and the second brother. Again, the first son comes home, and the royal carpet is rolled out, and the second son's got to be like, "This isn't fair." And again, I think it's the same lesson that's being taught throughout here. Somebody else, Foster. So yeah. So did you notice that? You think that was intentional? Yeah. Yep. So that yeah. So if you didn't hear Scott, he started with the people that worked the least, and those that started in the morning watched that whole scene unfold, thinking, "Oh, if they got paid 1 denarius, I know what we agreed to, but come on, we worked 4 times longer than they did." And then it got, it got dropped on them. No, you're still getting what you agreed to. So what Dave just brought up, the idea that 1 denarius was 1 day's wage, they were able to feed their family, these 11th-hour workers. Why weren't the first ones kind of rejoicing in that? Hey, you get to feed your family. That's great. And we have that today, and it kind of goes back to the thought I had earlier that when that happens to us, are we happy for those people? Or are we covetous? Are we envious? Are we angry, resentful? And that's a lesson for us. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's why it's interesting and it's also kind of dangerous, kind of to your point too, that you can get really detailed into this, right? And again, miss kind of the big picture. But there are so many things to kind of pull out from this, and that's why I really enjoy that we're kind of diving into this. Yes, ma'am. So grumbling throughout the way, everything it cost her in that situation, but being able to appreciate and rejoice in the reward at the end. Yeah, I can see that. Okay, Heather. Yeah. So yeah, so And so it's a great point. And again, now I've let it happen again, taking my comments from later in the lesson. No, it's perfect because, again, it's the idea that when we read this and we listen to this, who do we think we are in this parable? Which workers do we think we are? Yeah, we've been there from the beginning, right? We've been putting in the work. And again, maybe we're not. Yep, I agree. Okay, so let's finish this 13 through 16. But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? So the last shall be first, and the first shall be last." And just as we said, the master wanted those with the contract to see how much, was being paid to the others. He was showing his generosity to all, but also to those first workers. Tack Chumley, in his commentary on Matthew, says, "We who so easily think in terms of merit may be in for a surprise when the God of grace bestows final rewards at the judgment." We kind of have that mindset, right? Based on merit. What we do justifies what we get. And again, not to answer a later question, but that's kind of the upside down nature of God's kingdom. I deserve, I'm owed. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yes, I have something to say about that. I want to talk about grace here in a minute. I agree with that, Scott. You're going to answer that? Is that what you're doing? Yeah, all right. What's the lesson, Scott? Yeah. Yeah, and remember, that's who we talked about. We think he's addressing with this. Peter, you're going to receive what was promised, right? But so is somebody that signs up tomorrow. That's not a Jew. Yeah. God's kingdom. He gets to decide who gets in, right? Yeah. Yeah. They wanted to work. Yeah. Yeah, and I think there is a lot. I think a lot of the lesson here also is about the intent. When you look at the intent of these workers and how they were paid, um, we go back to Peter's question in 1926 about basically what about us? Um, you know, Jesus telling them here the kingdom's not simply awarded like a wage for great sacrifice, which the apostles had made to this point, but rather it depends on the spirit in which that sacrifice is made. So for us, asking ourselves, why do we serve? What's our motivation for serving? Is it because we expect a reward? Well, yeah, heaven should be something we're looking forward to. Um, God is infinitely generous and gracious and will always give us better than we deserve. But we serve because we love him. We serve because of what he's done for us. Heaven is not a reward for anything that we've done in this world. And again, I think there's another lesson here about humility versus pride. Those that are going to be entering the kingdom with humble hearts. Did I miss somebody? They knew throughout the day they were going to make, yeah. When you hand your life over to God, you have that sense of security. You have that sense of peace. It's a good point. It's a good point. And it's selfish versus selfless too. How do you view your life? Yes, sir. Yeah. What was the follow-up? Peter, there you go again. Running your mouth off. Yeah. Let me read. We just have a couple minutes left. Let me read this. Christians who study this parable identify with the employees who put in a full day's work rather than the add-ons at the end of the day. We like to think of ourselves as responsible workers, and the employer's strange behavior baffles us as it did the original hearers. We risk missing the point that God dispenses gifts, not wages. None of us gets paid according to merit, for none of us comes close to satisfying God's requirement for a perfect life. If paid on the basis of fairness, we would all end up in hell. I think some of you have already made similar comments. Equal pay for unequal work did not reflect the normal business practices in the first century Palestine. And so by endorsing this radical departure from the norm, Christ is vividly teaching us that standard operating procedure in the kingdom is radically different than one of the world's. He's given us a parable about grace, which cannot be calculated like a day's wage. So, we've got 1 minute maybe. Any other thoughts on this before we wrap up? Shani? Throughout the day, he's trying to find more and more to bring into the kingdom, giving everyone an opportunity so that none may perish. Yep. All right, I think I hear people gathering out there. We will conclude for today. Next week, Jeremy's going to be talking about the Good Samaritan, Luke chapter 10. Thank you all for your attention.